With a case that a country didn't believe could happen to them, no one knew how to handle this abduction. An 8-year-old boy became the face of Australia not once, but twice. First when his family won millions in the local lottery, and next when he was taken for that very reason. This case dives into the lottery laws at the time, with privacy being the last thing anyone thought about, until the ransom calls began. You are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke Makenna, but today's case is about the kidnapping after parents won the lottery, the Graeme Thorne case, which was Australia's first abduction for ransom case. Now, if you don't know, it's my absolute passion to tell these stories. I mean no harm or disrespect when I do so. So if that's something you'd like to support me in doing, all you have to do is make sure you are subscribed with the post notification bell on, giving this video a thumbs up, and leaving a nice comment down below. I also want to thank our sponsor, Harry's, for allowing me to continue creating these videos. Now, Harry's is actually a razor brand for everyone with zero pink tax and affordable prices. It's unisex, they deliver right to your home, and you can also pick what color you want, from ocean, sage, ember, chrome, and they will send you a starter pack that includes a 5-blade razor with a weighted handle, a blade cover, and foaming shaving gel. Now, Harry's razor has actually blown me away. I didn't think it'd be any different than just the cheap ones I pick up at the store. But ever since I started using Harry's, I have noticed that I have no ingrown hairs, no razor bumps, and I can get into so many different areas and get the hair that I've never been able to before. It's truly, truly incredible, and it makes it so much easier because there is that weighted handle. They also have a 100% money back guarantee, so you really can't go wrong with trying them. And if you would like to, you just have to go to harrys.com/Brooke Mckenna to get your starter set today. So now let's get back to the story. So it was 1960 in Australia, and the Thorne family lived in Sydney. Now, this was Father Basil, who was also a traveling salesman, as well as the mom, Frida, who was a stay-at-home mother, and their oldest child, Cheryl, as well as an 8-year-old Graeme and a 3-year-old Belinda. They lived in a suburb Bondi in a rented apartment at 70 Edward Street. However, they only actually had 2 children living with them due to Cheryl being institutionalized due to having a disability. Now, they were by no means wealthy. They often struggled with money. They were always working super hard, but their children were really given the best that they could be given. Graeme was known to be this polite yet reserved little boy, and he was often such a good brother to Belinda, and he was so respectful to his family, to adults, and any money that this family brought in, they invested in their children. And this is why Graeme was able to go to a very prestigious, well-respected school called the Scots College, which was a boarding school for boys in Bellevue Hill, which wasn't too far away from the family home. But on June 1st of 1960, the Thorne family would forever be changed. You see, Basil would come home and he would inform his family that they had won the 10th annual Sydney Opera House lottery. This was not a joke. The price of that lottery was £100,000, which is the equivalent to $3 million US today. It was quite a large chunk of money. You see, the New South Wales government were wanting to try to build this Sydney Opera House, and in order to do so, the construction prices were quite high. So they were raising money to do so by entering this lottery. Of course, you had to pay a pretty penny to actually enter most lotteries, and people would spend their hard-earned cash on the slim chance of winning the grand prize. This is exactly what Basil did. He spent £3, or the equivalent of 65 pounds today, or 78 US, and not ever in his wildest dreams did he believe that he was actually going to be chosen. However, when the ticket number was announced and it was 3932, Basil looked down and realized that was his ticket. Basil knew that his family no longer had to struggle. He in fact told the media that he wasn't going to be reckless, that he believed in the saying that charity begins at home, and that he was going to make this his policy. Immediately, the Thorne family's faces were published on the front of every newspaper across Sydney with the mention of this prize and saying that it was going to be paid on July 7th, about a month after. But it wasn't just their faces that was mentioned. It was also their full names as well as their address and pretty much everything about them, making them the perfect target. But nobody thought of it that way. There weren't any abductions in Australia at this time. There wasn't a ton of crime. Everyone just thought that it was wonderful that these, small town normal people could win the lottery, and it made tickets for the next lottery even more likely to sell, because then people realized you really can win the lottery. Except with this information that was given, random people could find them and could also figure out their phone number as well. Now, the Thornes during this time didn't sell their houses, didn't move away, rip their children away from school. They continued living pretty much exactly the same. In the coming weeks, they were really going to be smart with their money and save it and use it for things that would help their family's future. But on July 7th of 1960, the day when they were going to be getting their money, their life would change again, but for the worst. You see, their 8-year-old Graeme was headed to school like he always did in the mornings, or so his parents thought. You see, Graeme would always leave home at around 8:20, 8:30, and he would be going to be picked up by his mother Frida's friend Phyllis Smith, who would take him to school because her 2 boys also went to that same school, and so it was just easier that way. But he would actually often be up before he needed to be there, and he would walk to this gas station and he would get a bag of chips every single morning and then just sit and eat them while he waited for her. His mother Frida had seen him that morning, sent him off to school, knew that he was wearing his school uniform that was gray with a tie, also with a matching cap. He also had a backpack full of school supplies, and he had 2 handkerchiefs in his pocket. The last thing that he said to them was goodbye to his little sister Belinda, and he kissed his mom, and then he headed out. But when Phyllis arrived, she waited in the same exact spot she always did to pick Graeme up, and he wasn't coming. So she actually sent her boy in the store to look for him to make sure he just wasn't still in there buying his chips, but the son came out and said he's nowhere in there as well. So they decided to drive to the Thorne home to make sure that Graeme wasn't just sick that morning, and Frida forgot to tell her, but Frida was just as confused as she was and wondered if maybe Graeme had gotten another ride to school or had just decided to walk himself, which was unusual, but she was trying to be positive. Phyllis told Frida that she would go ahead, drop her boys off at school, have them look for Graeme, and then let her know. And so that's what she did. And a little while later, she came back to tell Frida a mother's worst nightmare, that her son was missing. Now, immediately the happiness of winning this lottery, no longer having to worry about money, was darkened by the thought that their son could be gone, and no amount of money was worth a child disappearing, but they didn't even know that that is what connected it yet. Frida immediately called the police to report him missing, but she couldn't go out and look for him because she did still have her 3-year-old Belinda, and her husband Basil actually wasn't working this day, but he had gone that morning because he had driven to the airport to catch a flight to collect the grand prize. So he was going to pick up their lottery money and wasn't going to be home until the end of the day. Thankfully, though, with Frida being home, she was able to answer the phone call that would come in about an hour later. The police department were already at the home, while a few members of the police department and Sergeant Larry O'Shea got there first. And so at 9:40 a.m. when this phone rang, there was somebody on the other end, someone with a thick European accent, demanding £25,000 by 5 p.m. that day. Just 7 hours to gather the money and pay this ransom. Sergeant O'Shea was actually handed the phone by a panicked Frida, and he answered pretending to be Basil, asking him to repeat what he wanted. And the kidnapper told him, "I have your boy. I want £25,000 before 5 o'clock this afternoon. I'm not fooling. If I don't get the money before 5 o'clock, I'll feed the boy to the sharks." Now, the thing about the sharks was that during this time in Australia, shark attacks and shark deaths were very prominent. And so this is something that a lot of people feared, which is why it was such a big threat. But Sergeant Larry told the kidnapper that he didn't think they were going to be able to get that much money in such a short amount of time because the family appeared not to have much money at all, and so he was really worried about not being able to find this boy due to the lack of money. And he actually had no idea about their recent lottery win. He was just trying to save this little boy in a way that the family could actually manage, and the family had yet to receive their money, so technically they couldn't have paid this ransom at this point anyways. Now, the kidnapper was angry at this, said that he would call back at 5 p.m. with more details before hanging up because he didn't tell them where this 25,000 pounds needed to go. It wasn't the sergeant's fault that he didn't know how to handle this though, because this was actually Australia's first ransom case in history. Officers had never dealt with this before. They weren't trained for it because it's not something that ever happened. Now, investigators had tried to keep this kidnapping out of the local paper, fearing that it would make everything worse. However, reporter Bill Perry decided to jump on the story as soon as he heard, and he went down to the Thornes to speak to Frida. However, he was met with officers who told him that if he had any compassion, he would leave. Now, thankfully he did, and that gave them a little bit more time to deal with this case without the public scrutiny. But by that afternoon, reporter Bill Jenkins at Daily Mirror in Sydney broke the case. Frida was so upset when she saw the headline, "Feed him to the sharks," on the front page of the newspaper. She was also dealing with everything by herself at that point, as Basil still wasn't home. She was trying to take care of her daughter, and that night Basil would return home. And as soon as he stepped off the airplane, he was being told about what had happened. Later on, he would go on TV where he would plead with the kidnappers to return his son.
Is there any appeal you'd like to make to...
Well, all I can say is that the person that's got him, if he's a father and got children of his own, well, for God's sake, send him back in one piece. I can't.
Now, with no way to pay this, the family and the police waited impatiently for this kidnapper to finally call them back. 5 p.m. came and went, and no call had come in. Meanwhile, the shop owner that Graeme would always stop by every morning to get the chips from was questioned. Now, he said that Graeme came in for the past couple of months for chips at the exact same time, saying, "I'll have the same today, mister," and that he was very old in the head, or wise, and that he would then take his chips, sit outside on his back, and wait for his ride. And the owner knew that this was a daily routine. He always had the chips ready. However, he said that he never saw Graeme that day. He didn't even go to get his normal chips, which he knew was odd. Due to this, and that the kidnapper did not make any sort of scene when kidnapping Graeme, investigators began to wonder if this was a group of people working. Obviously, it was a man on the phone, but what if there was also a woman who was the one who kidnapped him, which, of course, somebody would be more likely to get into a car with a woman, especially if she was saying, "I'm your mother's friend," than to have this man just trying to coerce him inside. They didn't know for certain, but this was a theory of theirs at this time. Like I said, 5 p.m. came and went at the Thorne household, and no call had come in. They had previously traced the call that came in earlier, but it was to an unlisted number. Now, by this point, Basil was home, and Frida finally got to relax for the first time, or to really let it sink in, and that is when she actually needed to be sedated by a doctor to calm her down, and one of her friends came over to watch Belinda. Police had set up a station where they could trace whatever phone call came in at this point, and hours later at 9:47 p.m. those in the Thorne residence were on high alert once again because the phone was ringing. A police officer answered the phone pretending to be Basil once again, and the kidnapper then demanded that the money be put in 2 paper bags. The officer was trying to stall him in order to get a trace on exactly where he was located, but the kidnapper then hung up without saying anything else, such as the drop-off location. Again, they did not know how to get this money to the kidnapper in order to save their son, and Basil actually refused to sleep because he was worried that they would call again. With some officers stationed at the Thorne house awaiting another call, there were many other officers searching the area. All police leave was actually canceled, so those who had been on vacation or had time off were forced to return and search for Graeme. Although many did not have a problem with this because it was such a huge case and the entire community was up in arms, and it was actually declared the biggest manhunt in Australian history. The search included ports and aircrafts, and investigators even enlisted well-known criminals and gang members for help because they wanted to help. They wanted to find this little boy, and so they were using their own men and resources to look for this possible man in the community, this kidnapper, and they were more than happy to help. By this point, witnesses were speaking up, and many in the Thornes neighborhood were saying that they had seen this unknown man in the park across the street from their home multiple times throughout that week. He appeared stocky and an olive-toned man and was always just lurking there. Yet the most important tip thus far would then come in, saying that the morning of the kidnapping around 8:20 a.m. they saw a man in a car that was parked oddly on the corner of Francis and Wellington Street, which is where Graeme would pick up his chips. Now, they said that they basically had to go around this car to get through. It was a very odd place to be parked, but they also knew what car this was. And they said that it was a blue 1955 Ford Custom Line. He also said that the driver's face was one that he would never forget. Now, at first, investigators were very suspicious. They were thinking, how do you know exactly the model of this car and that it was there in the exact same time? It just seemed a little too good to be true. So they began to take this witness around, point at different cars, and ask him to tell them exactly what that car was. And he could with pretty much every car. He was just a car enthusiast, and that is how he knew. And so they ended up searching for this car in the area and found 5,000 cars matching that description. But this was not easy because there was not a quick Google search of how many cars and how many matched. They had to go through the 270,000 cars and do it by paper and pen. They did this even though they believed that the car could have been stolen and wouldn't even help them find the kidnapper, but they did decide to question some of them in the nearby areas, but everyone ended up being cleared. Investigators did begin to wonder, though, how in the world this kidnapper got the Thornes phone number, because it had just been set up. They didn't have it listed, and it was just strange that they were able to figure this out so quickly. But then Freda Thorne remembered something. She told investigators that a few weeks prior to this, on June 14th, 13 days after it was announced that they had won the lottery, she got a knock on her door. Now, she said she didn't put two and two together until that moment, but it was this foreign accent on this man that matched the caller that was talking to them about the ransom. And she said that he was an investigator who was looking for a man named Mr. Bogner, and then asked Freda to confirm her phone number. He actually then went upstairs and went to different neighbors asking them questions. And so Freda thought, well, he is just an investigator. It isn't that odd, but she described him as an olive-toned man as well. And it appeared as though this kidnapper had been plotting this since the day he saw their faces on the newspaper. The next day, with no more calls from this kidnapper and no way to pay this ransom, Graeme's school bag was actually found. Now, it had nothing inside. This was about 23 minutes from his home and 25 minutes from the school. But then investigators received another huge tip, and that was that a witness had seen a boy who looked like Graeme with two men who were about in their 20s to 30s and a woman a little bit older leaving Pennant Hills. Now, this was about 30 minutes from where he vanished. Now, investigators decided to go to that area to see if they could find any more witnesses who had seen this group of people or just Graeme at all. And they were able to talk to the owners of a gas station who said that they saw these two men and the woman and Graeme pull up in a dark-colored Dodge type sedan with the front license plate missing around 10 p.m. the day that he had vanished. When they left, though, he ended up seeing their back license plate that did have the numbers, and he wrote them down. He did call the police, and they were able to put this in the system. Every officer in the area was to be looking for this car, but the vehicle that it was found on was not said to be the same vehicle that it was supposed to be on, so it was thought to be a stolen plate that would not lead them to the kidnapper. An officer did see a car with his license plate, tried to follow them, but the car ended up speeding off and he lost them. Although this was the second car that could have been connected to Graeme's abduction, it was not providing any more answers. Now, during this time, the New South Wales government did not know how to make this case end. It was collecting so much attention, it was becoming famous all around the world, and Australia was being known for this kidnapping, and this is something that they had just watched happen in America with the Lindbergh case, and the fact that baby Charlie had just disappeared. And I actually covered that case previously, so I'll have that link down below if you want more details on that. But it was one of the biggest abductions at that time, and Australia had watched America go through this. During this time, kidnapping was not a capital crime in Australia, and under the Crimes Act of 1900, the maximum penalty was 10 years for child abduction, while kidnapping was a maximum penalty of 14 years. Now, they wanted to change this to a higher sentence to prevent kidnappers from just coming out of the woodworks and doing this, and also they wanted to make it so that if a kidnapper returned the child unharmed, that they would get a lesser sentence to encourage more to be able to survive.
We propose amending the Crimes Act to deal with a situation of this kind. It's something without precedent, and of course the law as it stands will provide a maximum penalty of 10 years. I think, and I'm sure everybody in this state of ours thinks, that that's altogether too small.
Unfortunately, though, nothing could be done in time for Graeme, and a few days later, Graeme's cap as well as the contents of his school bag were found near the home. Rewards were announced first at £5,000 and £15,000 by different newspapers in the area, and due to the media attention of the kidnapping, just like the announcement for the lottery, more evil came than good. The Thorne's residence phone was lighting up with calls all the time, and multiple times these people on the other line would send everybody into a frenzy saying that they were the kidnappers, but when they would ask for specific information on Graeme or to speak to Graeme, they would realize that these were just prank callers making a joke out of a real-life kidnapping. The real kidnapper had yet to call back. The Thornes felt so helpless, and now that they actually had their lottery money, they were more than willing to give the kidnapper any and all of the money that they wanted in order to return their precious baby. Yet, he wasn't giving them the opportunity to, and investigators worried that this meant that something had gone horribly wrong. Unfortunately, this would be confirmed on August 16th when some kids playing near their homes in Seaford, the same place where Graeme's school bag was found, would find a blanket, and they went in to tell their parents, and later their fathers would come out and discover a body. This boy was under a ledge in the scrub nearby a suburb. He was also wrapped in a rug with his legs tied with a cord and a scarf around his neck. He was still wearing his school uniform with his right shoe missing, and he was officially identified as Graeme Thorne by his father. Now, the autopsy determined that Graeme had a fractured skull as well as had been strangled. So the cause of death could have either been blunt force trauma to the head or asphyxiation, or a combination of both. He was believed to be killed 24 hours after the abduction or within that time, and it was also a very violent death. Now, the rug wrapped around his body was examined, and scientists had actually found hairs, but they weren't human hairs. They were determined to be from a Pekingese dog, and it was this exact dog that they could pinpoint it to. And the rug itself had been made in Adelaide, which was where 3,000 of them had been sold. Plants were also found on Graeme, or fibers of a plant, that were believed to be from somewhere other than the dumping ground, and they found that these were from two different types of cypress trees, which would be strange to have two different types in one home or one area, so that's what they began looking for. Soil on him also showed tiny fragments of pink limestone mortar, which meant investigators believed that he had been stored underneath the house. All of this evidence was baffling, not just because this was the first ransom case, but it was also the first time that forensic science was used in a criminal investigation here. Now, investigators actually flew to Adelaide to where this rug was made and sold, and they tracked it back to a man who would say that he gave it to a woman after she gave birth named Miss Bradley. Meanwhile, other investigators were questioning people around the area where Graeme's body was found because it was, like I said, this little suburb area, and they wanted to know if they saw anything strange. Thankfully, they had, and many were more than willing to talk, including the postman. They were saying that they all had this neighbor, and that he had drove a blue Ford Custom Line car, but that wasn't all. He also had a whole family, and everybody left the morning of the kidnapping and were never seen again. His wife and his 3 kids left in the taxi that morning. He wasn't with them, but he never returned to the home, and they never saw them again. His name? Stephen Leslie Bradley. The name was something that investigators recognized, and this wasn't just because of the rug and that man saying, "Oh, I gave it to a Miss Bradley." It was because they had questioned this exact man on his Ford Custom Line car back when they were looking into that, and he said that he did have this car, but he wasn't in Bondi, where Graeme was taken from that day, and it couldn't have been him, and there was no other reason to believe that this man was suspicious until now. When his picture was shown to Frida, she immediately identified him as the man who came to her door prior to the abduction. But who was this man? Well, Stephen Leslie Bradley was a Hungarian immigrant born on March 15th of 1926 to Josip Barnare, who was an architect, and Clarice. His birth name was actually Estevan, but when he moved to Australia in 1950, he ended up changing it. He did jobs as a life insurance salesman, as a male nurse in a psychiatric hospital, and working in a poker machine factory. He then married his second wife, who was Ava Laidlaw, who would later be killed in a car accident. They did have a daughter together that he was now the single father of, and many believe that this car accident with Ava was actually very suspicious. He also would inherit most of her money. 3 years before the murder in 1957, Stephen was charged with fraud, but those charges were dropped. He went on to marry a woman named Magda Whitman, who already had 2 children. So they blended their families and they became one. And this was the family who lived nearby where Graeme's body was dumped. Or they did until that day. Stephen was said to be a very threatening man due to his large stature, a man who never smiled. He was short, stocky, dark-haired, and balding, and he loved to live beyond his means. He thought that he was wealthy. He got fancy cars, expensive suits, even though they didn't really have the money for that. But then the guest house of their home burned down, and they got the insurance money for that, and that is when he would see the Thorne family's picture in the newspaper. It was theorized that he saw this picture and he thought back to an abduction for ransom that had happened just a little bit prior, about 4 months earlier in Paris. This was Eric Pagot. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, but he was a 4-year-old grandson of the man who created a $1 million automobile company in Paris, and he was returned 2 days after the ransom was paid. His kidnappers were caught. They were Pierre-Marie Larcher and Roland, as well as accomplices, and they were identified as the kidnappers and charged, and everyone was sentenced to 20 years in jail. But it was said that Stephen Bradley maybe saw these 2 articles in the newspaper, family won the lottery, child abducted for ransom, and he concocted an idea because it was very strange. He was said to be the most unlikely kidnapper. He was a great father, a great husband, and he had a daughter who was just 1 year younger than Graeme. When investigators looked inside the home nearby where Graeme's body was found, that the Bradleys had just vacated very quickly, a tassel of the rug that looked a lot like the one that Graeme was wrapped in was found. There was also pink mortar in the home, and there were 2 different cypress trees outside. The problem was Stephen was now the one who was missing. They went to his apartment where he was supposed to now be living with his family in Manly on October 3rd, and they found that he wasn't there either. But inside this apartment, they went looking around and they found a photo of their children on that very rug. as well as photo proof that they had a Pekingese dog. What happened to this blue Ford? Well, it had been sold, and investigators were able to locate it and talk to the new owner. They did some tests, and they would find hairs and other evidence matching Graeme. With so much evidence, they couldn't just let Stephen get away, so they found evidence of him boarding the SS Himalaya 7 days earlier on September 26th with his family. And when the boat docked in Sri Lanka, or what is now Sri Lanka, investigators from Sydney were waiting there for him. On October 10th of 1960, 3 months after the abduction, the kidnapper was arrested. Now, he told his wife and kids to go ahead and go on to London where they were headed because he wouldn't be very long. Weeks later, after fighting with the Sri Lanka government, trying to get him extradited back to Australia, Stephen Bradley was extradited and allegedly made a confession to one of the officers that day. The next day, he gave his official written confession that read, "I went out and watched the Thorne boy leaving the house and seen him for about 3 mornings, and I had seen where he went. One morning, I had followed him to school. 1 or 2 mornings, I had seen a woman pick him up and take him to school. On the day we moved from Clontarf, I went out to Edward Street. I parked the car in the street. I got out of the car and waited on the corner until the boy walked down to the car." Police actually had to form a barrier around the plane to make sure that they could get Stephen out safely, and they took a rear exit gate to get him to the police station. Stephen said that basically he went to the Thornes' home just to get their number, but then wanted to make it look legit, so he went to all the neighbors' homes just in case she was going to check with them to see if he was a real investigator. And then he would watch Graeme every time he left the house walking down the street. But as far as the abduction, Stephen had coaxed Graeme into his car, claiming that Phyllis was sick and couldn't take him to school. This 8-year-old boy didn't know any better, so he got in the car and he was taken to Centennial Park, where he was drugged, gagged, beaten, and thrown in the trunk of the car. Stephen then made the ransom from the payphone. However, even though Stephen confessed to the kidnapping, he refused to confess to the actual murder. He claimed that Graeme had accidentally suffocated when he locked him inside the back of his car in his garage for hours. He said he was working with his movers inside of his house, and when he went back to check on him, he was no longer breathing. So he ended up wrapping him in a rug and dumping him. Now, Frida was brought in and asked to pick the guy who came to her door out of a lineup. She picked Stephen, but then they said, "Will you touch him to prove that that's the man that you're talking about?" And she said she would not go near him. The witness who had identified the blue custom line also was brought in for the lineup, and he also chose Stephen. But on March 26th of 1961, the trial began, and Stephen Bradley pled not guilty. He said that he only confessed fearing the safety for his own family. However, even though Stephen was adamant that Graeme's death was accidental and not murder, forensic experts took the stand to disprove this. And they ended up claiming that they did an experiment where they too got into the trunk of a car for 7 hours and they never stopped breathing. They said that it couldn't have caused his death. Stephen's wife Magda did testify in his favor. There were 60 witnesses in total, and throughout the trial, Stephen seemed very unaffected with zero remorse. The trial did last for 9 days, with reporters basically updating the public every 30 minutes. Finally, Stephen Bradley was found guilty and sentenced to life, and the crowd went wild. There was a huge crowd inside, outside, watching on TV. Everybody was cheering, and the judge pretty much let it happen because he knew it was an important case to the public who had inserted themselves in trying to find this boy. Frida Thorne had sat in the back the whole trial. She really didn't say much. She had her head down, but she instantly began crying, and Basil grabbed onto her and began crying as well. Stephen, though, stood up and said that he believed before he even got there that he would be convicted of the crime because of the prejudice against him, which he believed was the same as jealousy. He blamed the publicity that was against him and said that the jury tried to do their best but were influenced by powerful emotions. The crowd heard him say this and began screaming at him, and as he was taken out of the court, women tried to attack him. Prison guards who watched over him described him as intelligent but insecure, an opportunist, and a hopeless liar. He was actually transferred to a supermax prison after he was beaten by prisoners so he could be protected. His appeals were denied, and 4 years later, his wife Magda divorced and moved back to Europe. Now, what I didn't tell you is that Magda was actually suspected to be part of the kidnapping by a lot of the public. They believed that she could have been the person who actually kidnapped Graeme, as a woman would have it easier. But she was never investigated by anyone, and they don't have anything that would connect her. Stephen never said anything about her in his confessions either. 7 years later, on October 6th of 1986, Stephen Bradley would die of a heart attack while playing tennis in jail at the age of 42. The Thorne family ended up moving to Rose Bay and is said to have never recovered. 12 years after Stephen's death, in 1978, Basil Thorne would pass away, and he was said to still be grieving his son. In 2012, Frida passed away as well, never healed from the murder of her child. But due to this case, the laws around lottery winners were changed drastically, and winners were actually able to remain anonymous due to what happened to Graeme. After this, Australia no longer believed that they were in a peaceful, safe place, void of things as horrific as abduction, especially for money. It is now a 25-year sentence in Australia for detaining a person for advantage such as ransom. This was never even thought of to be a law before because it did not happen. This was the first time ever. I think with the very, very little knowledge that investigators had at this time on how to handle this, especially because they didn't even really have forensic scientists working for them. It was really the first case that they brought in scientists and were asking them for help. I think they did an incredible job on finding Graeme's killer. I think unfortunately before they could even think about finding him, he was already dead. But I think they did a wonderful job in catching his killer and bringing him justice. And you guys know I don't say that lightly because there's a lot of negligence in the criminal justice system, but I think here, for what little information and knowledge they had, they worked with what they had. And it was the second best possible outcome, since the first would be that Graeme would still be alive. I think that it's a interesting case because a lot of the times people win the lottery think it's going to change their life for the best, and it actually ends up changing their life for the worst. So you tell me, if you could win the lottery, do you think you would want to? Sorry if my voice sounds a little bit odd during this video or my storytelling. I'm not feeling the best, but I try to power through for you guys. So don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces.